The Roman Republic is often remembered as a system that collapsed under pressure. Too much territory, too much ambition, too much violence. The familiar story suggests inevitability, as if a political order simply outgrew itself and gave way to something more efficient. Empire, in this telling, appears as a solution, imperfect, perhaps brutal, but structurally necessary. Yet this assumption hides a quieter contradiction. For centuries, Rome expanded without abandoning its republican form. It absorbed enemies, governed distant provinces, and commanded immense resources while still insisting that no man was king. Authority was distributed, power was temporary, office was rotational. Even as inequality hardened and violence crept into politics, the language of the Republic remained intact. Romans continued to speak of liberty, of law, of ancestral restraint. What unsettles the record is not that Rome became an empire, but that it did so while insisting, almost to the end, that it had not. The transformation did not arrive announced. There was no single proclamation, no formal abolition of republican institutions. Instead, the change occurred through a decision that appeared limited, even cautious, at the time. A decision framed as protection rather than surrender. A decision made not against the Republic, but in its name. Understanding that moment requires resisting the comfort of hindsight. It means returning to a Rome that still believed itself capable of self-correction, even as its political habits were already bending under strain. By the 1st century BCE, the Republic was no longer the small city-state its founders had imagined. Its armies operated across 3 continents. Its economy was saturated with war spoils and enslaved labor. Its political class competed not only for honor, but for survival. Elections were violent. Laws were weapons. Loyalty increasingly attached to individuals rather than institutions. And yet none of this was unprecedented. Rome had faced crises before: class conflict, military disaster, internal dissent, and had survived by improvisation rather than reinvention. Temporary measures were introduced, then withdrawn. Extraordinary commands were granted, then relinquished. The Republic had learned to stretch without breaking. This history of adaptation created a dangerous confidence. Romans came to believe that their system could absorb any strain, provided the right men were entrusted with emergency powers. The problem was no longer whether authority should be concentrated, but who could be trusted to hold it briefly and then let it go. It was within this logic that Julius Caesar rose, not as an outsider overthrowing the system, but as its most skilled participant. Caesar's career followed established republican pathways. He sought office, he courted popular support, he leveraged military success into political relevance. None of this was illegal. None of it, at first, appeared revolutionary. Even his alliance with Pompey and Crassus, later labeled the First Triumvirate, was framed as a practical arrangement within existing norms. But something subtle was changing beneath the surface. Military command was no longer a temporary duty. Provinces were no longer brief assignments. Armies became personal instruments, bound by loyalty and reward rather than civic obligation. Soldiers followed generals who could promise land, wealth, and protection, not abstract constitutional principles. When Caesar's term in Gaul neared its end, the Republic faced a familiar dilemma, intensified by unfamiliar scale. Tradition required that he relinquish his command before returning to Rome. His enemies insisted on this rule, citing law and precedent. Caesar understood the demand differently. To surrender his army was to surrender himself to prosecution, humiliation, and political erasure. The standoff that followed was not merely a power struggle. It was a test of the Republic's capacity to enforce restraint without destroying one of its own. Each side claimed legality. Each invoked the Republic's survival. The Senate issued ultimatums. Caesar delayed. Negotiations failed. Then came the decision that history remembers, though often too simply. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The act itself was small in physical terms. A river, narrow and unimpressive, but symbolically it marked a boundary that had held for centuries. No general was permitted to enter Italy under arms. To do so was to declare war on the state. Yet Caesar did not present his march as rebellion. He spoke of defense, of rights violated, of enemies corrupting the republic from within. His language was not that of a usurper, but of a citizen compelled to act when institutions failed to protect justice. This framing mattered. It allowed many Romans to see the crisis not as the end of the republic, but as another of its violent corrections. Civil war was tragic, but not unfamiliar. Strong men had emerged before and stepped aside afterward. The hope, unspoken but persistent, was that this too would pass. What followed strained that hope without immediately destroying it. Caesar defeated his rivals with speed and restraint. He pardoned enemies. He restored order. He filled offices. He maintained the outward forms of republican governance. The Senate still met. Magistrates were still elected. Laws were still passed. But the balance had shifted. Power now resided less in institutions than in proximity to one man. Caesar accumulated titles, dictator, consul, pontifex maximus, not by abolishing offices, but by holding them simultaneously and repeatedly. Each concentration was justified as temporary. Each extension answered a crisis that never quite ended. The republic had not been dismantled. It had been hollowed. After Caesar's assassination, many believed the problem solved. Tyranny, they thought, had been removed. The republic could be restored. But what they underestimated was how deeply the decision at the Rubicon, and the logic behind it, had altered expectations. The civil wars that followed were not fought to prevent empire, but to determine its form. Octavian, later Augustus, learned from Caesar's failure not that power should be refused, but that it should be disguised. He rejected the title of king. He spoke the language of restoration. He claimed reluctance even as authority settled permanently in his hands. By the time the republic was declared restored, it existed mostly as memory and ritual. The decisive moment had already passed, long before crowns or emperors appeared. It passed when extraordinary power ceased to feel extraordinary, when crossing a boundary felt less like betrayal than necessity. Seen this way, Rome's transformation was not the result of ambition alone, nor of popular decay, nor of institutional weakness in isolation. It emerged from a repeated choice to resolve immediate instability by concentrating authority, while trusting that restraint would return later. Each time, the logic seemed sound. Each time, the cost appeared manageable, and each time the threshold shifted slightly until restraint itself became an expectation no longer placed on the system, but on the character of individuals. This is the fracture that endures. Because the Republic did not fall when laws were ignored, but when they were selectively suspended in the name of survival. Not when power was seized, but when it was granted willingly, with the assumption that it would be surrendered once the danger passed. The unsettling question is not why Rome accepted empire, but why it believed it could approach the edge repeatedly without crossing it. At what point does emergency become habit? At what point does trust in exceptional leadership replace trust in structure? And how often does a system discover too late that the decision meant to save it has quietly redefined what it is willing to tolerate? Rome's story resists closure because it does not offer a clear moment of loss. There is no single day when the Republic disappears, only a sequence of choices, each defensible on its own, each made under pressure, each narrowing the space for reversal. Perhaps this is why the Republic lingered so long in Roman speech, even after it had ceased to function as before. The name survived because the memory of restraint survived. What faded was the collective willingness to insist upon it when it became inconvenient. The decision that turned Rome from republic to empire was not only a march across a river. It was the quieter acceptance that some boundaries could be crossed if the reasons felt urgent enough. And once that belief settles in, history suggests, the return to restraint becomes less a matter of law than of faith. For more reflections on history, power and human nature, subscribe to Timeless Questions.